Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Um, think about the most, compassionate, loving concepts human beings have ever come up with.
Right. Yeah. Absolute peace, spiritual harmony, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But then, on the flip side, think about the most brutal, systematic, and horrific atrocities in human history. And that brings us to the central, kind of unsettling paradox we're tackling today.
Right. How do these faiths that are built entirely on foundations of peace so often become the actual engines of mass destruction?
Yeah, it's wild. We're going to explore this really raw tension today between, belief in a benevolent God, the sharp atheistic critiques of religious violence, and the incredibly dangerous psychological power of unquestionable divine authority.
It really is a paradox that has, it's defined the borders of our world and rewritten our laws. It forces us to question the actual architecture of human morality.
It really does. So, welcome to this deep dive into an intensely heavy but absolutely vital set of notes on the intersection of religion and violence. And our mission today is to unpack what might be the most disturbing question of human history.
Why the greatest massacres and persecutions have so frequently happened within a strictly religious framework.
Yeah, exactly. And we are speaking directly to you, the listener, because understanding how authority bypasses our normal moral hardwiring is just crucial in today's world. And as we prepare to jump into this heavy historical record, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Because we're bypassing the warm, abstract concept of personal faith today.
Right, we're looking directly at the cold, undeniable historical data. And the sheer scale of the historical burden is just, well, it's staggering.
Staggering almost doesn't even cover it. We are looking at centuries of institutionalized bloodshed. Take the Crusades, for instance. We aren't just talking about battlefield casualties in the Middle Ages. We're talking about the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099, where historical accounts describe crusaders literally wading through blood up to their ankles.
Wow.
Yeah, slaughtering men, women, and children just to, quote-unquote, purify the Holy Land. And then you have the Inquisition.
Which wasn't even the chaos of a war, right? It was a system.
Exactly. It was cold, calculated, bureaucratic violence. You literally had notaries sitting at desks meticulously recording the screams of suspected heretics and witches on the rack.
That is just terrifying.
It was all institutionalized under the banner of saving souls. And then the 30 Years' War, which was a conflict fundamentally centered on Catholic and Protestant divides, it wiped out anywhere from a quarter to a third of the population in some German states.
It's so incredibly tempting, almost like a psychological defense mechanism, to just relegate all of that to the Dark Ages, to tell ourselves that, oh, people just didn't have a modern moral compass back then.
Right, like it's just ancient history.
Yeah. But looking at the timeline, we are dragged kicking and screaming right up into the modern era.
We really are. The modern era offers no reprieve at all. We see Islamic terror attacks designed to maximize civilian casualties dominating global headlines for decades. We see the rise of Hindu nationalist violence resulting in severe bloodshed. We even see Buddhist majorities, which, Westerners almost exclusively associate with mindfulness and absolute pacifism.
Right, like meditation and peace.
Exactly. But we see them targeting the Rohingya minority in Myanmar with horrific state-backed violence. These are completely different continents, different theologies, completely different cultures.
But there is a chilling common denominator running through all of them.
Yes, they rely on divine legitimacy to justify the eradication of human life.
Okay, let me push back on that framework for a second, because a very common defense comes up here. Is religion actually the driver, or is it just the weapon of choice?
What do you mean?
Think about a computer operating system. Violent human nature, greed, territorial disputes, that's the hardware. Is religion just the software that bad actors boot up to run their violent programs? Meaning the religion itself is entirely innocent? Like people always say, real religion is peaceful.
Yeah, the idea that violent actors just instrumentalize a passive religion for their own gain is a supernatural defense. But examining the psychology behind these events shows that answer is fundamentally insufficient.
Why not?
Because religion doesn't function merely as a passive piece of software you can swap in and out. It operates as an entirely new core architecture. It actively rewrites the user's moral code.
Yeah.
It provides a highly specific, uniquely powerful framework that makes massive, systematic violence not just excusable, but morally obligatory.
So if religion is rewriting the core architecture, how exactly does it bypass our biological and psychological hardwiring? Because normally, humans have a built-in moral gag reflex against killing. Empathy is an evolutionary survival trait.
Exactly, we're social animals.
So what specifically happens in the brain when a command to commit violence comes from, quote, God, rather than a politician or a general?
Well, that brings us to the 4 specific mechanisms of divine justification. The first is the ultimate trump card: God commanded it.
Right.
In a normal secular society, if a president or dictator says go to war, you can question their logic. You can leak their motives to the press or organize a protest.
You're arguing peer-to-peer with another human being.
Exactly. But when an action is framed as the direct mandate from the divine, it instantly creates an unquestionable authority.
Because you can't protest God.
Right. Questioning the order is no longer political dissent. It's framed as rebellion against the very fabric of reality and the creator of the universe.
Which feeds directly into the sharpest atheistic critiques of faith. Atheist thinkers point out that the very concept of unquestionable divine authority inherently short-circuits human morality.
It absolutely does.
Because, how do you debate someone whose policy advisor is omniscient? You can't veto the Almighty. It completely removes the mechanism of doubt, and doubt is the foundation of empathy and moral reasoning.
And that removal of doubt is exactly what enables the second mechanism, the total dehumanization of the enemy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's rarely framed as a dispute over land or resources. Religious framing often dictates that the other side is literally aligned with the devil or acting as agents of pure cosmic evil.
So you aren't looking at a fellow human being with a family and hopes anymore.
No, you're looking at a spiritual contagion.
You aren't murdering a neighbor, you're eradicating a disease.
And eradicating a disease feels like a moral triumph. Then the third mechanism shifts the perspective of reality itself. It relies on the doctrine that this material world is merely temporary.
Like a testing ground.
Yeah, and the next world eternity is the true reality. When you genuinely internalize that this mortal life is just a fleeting shadow, it drastically minimizes the horrific costs of violence in the present.
The burning of a village, the suffering, the death.
It all becomes a minor, temporary inconvenience compared to the infinite span of eternity. It devalues human life in the present by inflating the value of the afterlife.
Wait, I'm going to pause on that because that leads right into the fourth mechanism, martyrdom. Biologically, our strongest imperative is survival. Every cell in our body is screaming at us to stay alive.
Right.
Are you saying these belief systems are literally hacking our evolutionary biology?
They absolutely hack the biological imperative. The fourth mechanism is the promise that martyrdom guarantees heaven. Psychologists refer to terror management theory.
Which suggests humans are driven by a deep subconscious terror of our own mortality, right?
Precisely. Religion, under these violent frameworks, completely overrides that biological fear. It hacks the brain's reward system. If dying in violence is the literal key to eternal paradise, death ceases to be the ultimate sacrifice.
It becomes a promotion.
Yes. You erase the fear of death and you create an unstoppable force.
When you lay those 4 mechanisms out, unquestionable authority, demonizing the outgroup, devaluing the present world, and overriding the fear of death with eternal reward, it becomes so clear why atheistic philosophers argue religion is uniquely dangerous.
Secular ideologies really struggle to match it.
Yeah. You can try to inspire troops with radical nationalism, but telling them the supreme architect of existence demands their obedience and will reward them with a utopia. That flips a switch in the human psyche.
It creates a closed ideological loop. But to understand how this operates in the real world, we have to look at the psychology of the individual. How does an ordinary person suddenly download this radicalized operating system?
Right, someone with a job and a family.
The research on religious radicalization shows that it rarely, if ever, starts with theology.
Wait, really? So a person doesn't just sit down in a library, read a violent passage in a holy book, and walk out a radical?
Almost never. Radicalization usually begins with a profound sense of social exclusion, a desperate search for identity, and a feeling of total powerlessness. Yeah, you have an individual who feels alienated, marginalized, or stripped of agency by society. They are psychologically adrift. And religion, or rather a radicalized dogmatic version of it, swoops in precisely on that vulnerable ground.
Giving them everything they're lacking.
Exactly. Profound cosmic meaning, immediate and fiercely loyal belonging to an in-group, and a legitimate, divinely ordained enemy to blame for all their pain.
So the individual is already primed. The dry wood of their social isolation is already stacked, and the religious dogma is just the match that sets it on fire.
That psychological insight allows us to understand the pathway of the violent individual without excusing their horrific actions. But it does not excuse the role that the religious texts and institutions play.
Because the foundational texts are still providing the explicit vocabulary and divine justification for the violence?
Yes, the precedent is there.
And that forces us to confront the actual texts of the holy books. Because we can talk about psychological vulnerabilities all day, but the written words are sitting right there on the page. Like in the Old Testament, you have narratives where God directly commands the Israelites to commit total genocide against groups like the Amalekites.
Telling armies to leave nothing alive that breathed.
Yet not even the livestock. In the Quran, you find explicit verses calling believers to strike the necks of unbelievers during war. And the Tanakh contains mass massacres framed as righteous conquests.
Ignoring those texts is intellectually dishonest. The violence is not merely a misinterpretation conjured out of thin air by a marginalized youth. It is frequently right there in the foundational architecture of these major world religions.
Modern believers usually try to soften this, though. They'll say, you have to read it in historical context, or it's an allegory, or those were brutal times and God had to speak in a language they understood.
That's the standard defense, yes.
But this is where the atheistic evaluation really tightens the screws. Here is the ultimate dilemma. If these texts are the literal divine revelation of a morally perfect, omniscient God, how do you explain explicit commands to slaughter infants?
That tension is the exact fault line where theology and secular criticism collide. If a text is truly divine, perfect, and eternally true for all generations, the historical context defense shatters.
Right, you can't just brush it off as ancient geopolitical strategy.
Exactly. If the creator's morality is absolute, a command to commit genocide is a major problem. The deepest issue is that these texts are held up as ultimate, infallible moral guides for modern life, yet they contain episodes of supreme immorality by any modern human standard.
Which forces religious institutions to perform incredible theological gymnastics.
It does, and when fundamentalist groups reject those gymnastics and choose to read the violent verses literally, they have the full weight of the text on their side to radicalize vulnerable people.
Okay, to make sure we are rigorously analyzing the whole board here, we have to look at the secular mirror. Because if we just stop here, it sounds like we are laying the entirety of human evil at the feet of religion. Let's play devil's advocate and remove God entirely.
The 20th century provides the ultimate test case for a world operating without divine frameworks.
We see some of the most massive, industrialized slaughters in human history, completely disconnected from theology. The tens of millions dead under Stalin's Soviet Union.
The systematic factory line horror of Nazi Germany.
And the killing fields of Pol Pot in Cambodia, where a quarter of the population was eradicated. These regimes were driven by secular ideologies. Communism, fascism, radical ethno-nationalism. God wasn't in the driver's seat, the state was. Doesn't this definitively prove that mass violence is not a monopoly of religion?
It proves that violence is a distinctly human capacity, but what is truly revealing is how those secular regimes achieved such massive scales of slaughter. They didn't invent a new psychological framework.
What do you mean?
They simply hijacked the religious one. They used the exact same four mechanisms we just discussed, replacing God with the state or the ideology.
Oh, let's map that out. So instead of God commanded it, it becomes the state or the Führer commands it. And that authority becomes completely unquestionable.
Right. The political leader is elevated to a godlike, infallible status. Second, the dehumanization mechanism is identical. Instead of demons or heretics, the enemy becomes the bourgeoisie in Soviet Russia or the Jewish people in Nazi Germany.
Framed not as political opponents, but as biological contagions.
That must be eradicated for the health of the utopian body, yes.
And the temporary world mechanism, how does that work?
It is replaced by the promise of the future utopia. The 1,000-year Reich, or the perfect communist society, becomes the secular version of heaven. The horrific suffering and mass starvation of the present are justified as necessary, temporary growing pains.
To achieve that perfect future. And finally, dying for the revolution or the motherland becomes the highest possible glory, overriding the fear of death just as martyrdom does.
Exactly. The secular state simply filed the serial numbers off the religious mechanisms and applied them to political dogma.
That is a terrifying realization. The mechanisms of mass atrocity are identical, whether the flag has a cross, a crescent, or a hammer and sickle on it. But to ensure we are looking at the complete picture of religion's power, we have to flip the coin.
We do.
Because the exact same powerful mechanisms, community, ultimate meaning, and divine mandate, they can drive profound world-changing peace.
The historical record demands we acknowledge the pacifist power of faith. Consider Martin Luther King Jr. His entire civil rights movement, the entire philosophy of nonviolent resistance in America, was fundamentally rooted in the Christian church.
Drawing directly on biblical theology regarding the inherent dignity of the human soul.
Right. Look at Mahatma Gandhi, who utilized profound Hindu and Jain convictions to push for Hindu-Muslim unity and mobilize millions in nonviolent resistance against the British Empire.
And consider the immense foundational role that the church has played in fighting and eventually dismantling the brutal system of apartheid in South Africa.
Absolutely.
So we have a historical reality where religion is actively causing medieval crusades and modern terror, while simultaneously serving as the bedrock for the greatest movements of social justice and racial equality. And we have secular states building utopian theories in libraries, but building horrific gulags in practice.
It's a heavy contradiction.
Let's synthesize this. So it's not the belief in a higher power that's the actual poison. The poison is dogma mixed with power. Whether the dogma asserts God demands this purification or the state requires this purge, the psychological result is identical.
Dogmatic thinking is the true apex predator of human history. It is the absolute, unwavering certainty that your in-group holds the ultimate, unassailable truth, and that the out-group is an obstacle to that truth.
It doesn't matter if that dogma is wearing the robes of a cleric or the uniform of a dictator.
Exactly. When dogmatic thinking marries institutional power, it builds a fortress around itself. It renders its own actions completely immune to internal questioning or external empathy.
Because the ideology is unquestionable.
Yes. The moment an ideology becomes unquestionable, atrocity doesn't just become possible, it becomes inevitable. Religion just happens to be one of the oldest, most deeply ingrained, and most psychologically effective ways to make an idea unquestionable.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring this entirely back to you, the listener.
Yeah.
You are probably not gearing up for a medieval crusade today.
Probably not.
But you are navigating a world that is absolutely drowning in extreme polarization, algorithmic radicalization, and very loud voices demanding your absolute loyalty.
It's an ocean of information.
Yeah, where charismatic leaders, whether they're religious figures, populist politicians, or even the unseen algorithms curating your social media feed, are constantly trying to bypass your moral gag reflex. Recognizing the inherent danger of unquestionable authority is no longer just an academic exercise in history.
It is a vital daily survival skill for your own critical thinking and empathy. And as we close this exploration, consider one final, lingering paradox drawn from the deepest implications of everything we have unpacked today. Think about those massive historical wars, the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the millions of lives extinguished in the name of absolute faith.
Mm-hmm.
If God didn't actually command those wars, then who were all those millions of people really sacrificed for? But if God did command them, can we truly consider that God a moral authority?
Wow. That is a question that stops you right in your tracks, and it is exactly the kind of tension we want to leave you wrestling with. We want to thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex, unflinching journey today. Keep digging into the history, keep pushing back against the easy answers, and above all, keep questioning the unquestionable. We will catch you on the next Deep Dive.